Okay. Okay. Should I go ahead and start then? We set.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, Death Valley has a very long history of mining, and it was, in fact, this mining activity and its effects on the landscape that prompted Herbert Hoover in 1933 to establish Death Valley as a national monument. And at that time, he instituted a ban on mining, but it didn't last very long. It was later reinstituted under FDR. But by the 1970s, both the public and the Park Service were very concerned about the um, increased effects of mining in National Park Service units. Most of this was due to advances in technology that involved larger and heavier machinery and strip mining in open pits. So in 1976, Congress passed the Mining in the Parks Act, which basically outlawed open pit mines, and it closed the Park Service units to any future mining. It also mandated validity tests on existing claims. So the regional historian for the Park Service, Western regional historian at this time, was Gordon Chappell. And Gordon decided that this would be a great time to send people into the park to assess the remaining mining sites for historical significance and educational value. John Latcher and I were basically new historians with the Park Service in the Denver Service Center, and we were assigned the task of writing an historic resource study, a history of mining of Death Valley. So, because of the park size, we divided up the park. John took sites on the east side, and I took sites on the west. And for 2 years, we did extensive field work with four-wheel drive vehicles, driving in and examining each of the mining sites in our areas and photographing them and documenting the remains on site. In addition, we did extensive microfilm research of local newspapers, which through the years, especially in the early years, described in great detail the mining that was going on in Death Valley, the companies involved, what they were mining for, how much they were producing, and so forth. And we also read numerous state mineralogist reports, mining journals, visited historical societies and universities and archives, both in California and Nevada. And based on this research, we were able to make assessments of significance for these mining sites based on what kind of mineral they were extracting, how much they produced, what types of technology they used, and their association with people important in the history of mining in Death Valley. And for the most significant sites, we wrote up National Register nomination forms. So while these sites could have been reclaimed and the ruins removed after the Mining in the Parks Act, instead the Park Service decided that these sites would be retained for the education of future generations. Now, some of the sites that were less significant were left to what was termed then benign neglect. They were just kind of left to molder into the desert as due to natural deterioration, whereas the more significant sites had safety and stabilization work performed on them. Mining has always been difficult in Death Valley due to the heat, the scarcity of water and fuel, the rugged terrain, very primitive mining technology, and the expense of transporting ore out of the park. Involved a variety of minerals, talc, borate, gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, and many, many more. Death Valley became a national park in 1994 under Bill Clinton and is now the largest national park in the lower 48 states. It's about 3.4 million acres. The importance of Death Valley as a microcosm of Western US mining from the 1860s clear up until 2005, when the Billy Borate mine closed, really cannot be overstated. There's no place like it within the national park system. So I have a few slides here to show kind of what John and I found and how our findings shed some light both on habitations of the miners, where they lived, how they built their homes, ranging from stone structures like this, next to, here we go, to wooden and metal structures, mostly one-room cabins, some of them dug into the hillside next. But some people who came to the park actually set down some roots and built larger homesteads such as this, with houses and outbuildings and a mill to process the ore. Next. In the 1980s, when talc was being mined in Warm Spring Canyon, the company built larger camps. This had both a kitchen and bunk room next, and also provided recreational facilities for the miners, such as this swimming pool, which has since been filled in for safety reasons. Next, we also did a lot of research on how ore was processed in the park, ranging from Harmony Borax Works down on the floor of Death Valley, next, to Wild Rose charcoal kilns in which fuel was burned, in which wood was burned to provide fuel to smelters that were processing silver. Next. One of the earliest types of ore processing techniques, the arrastra, can be found in Death Valley also. Rocks were dragged around this trough early on by people or by animals, but later there were mechanized ones such as this. Next. There are also a variety of other just various equipment, hotshot engines and ball mills and jaw crushers that can be found throughout the park. Next. The Keene Wonder Mine, as a National Register site, is a great example of an aerial tramway system. It's been recently stabilized, and aerial tramways were about the only way to effectively bring down ore from the mines higher up in the hills to the valley floor for processing or transport. The Skidoo stamp mill had numerous stamps that were used to pulverize the ore. This site has been stabilized also and is a great interpretive area. Next. We also found a lot of information on transportation, such as, ranging from the 20 mule team borax wagons, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with from Death Valley days, to items like the old Dyna steam traction engine, which was manufactured to replace the wagons but did not work as well. And then on site, we found numerous jerry-rig type of conveyances, like this wagon that was on a winch that could go up and down the hills to transport supplies on site. And in some places, miners just left their tool sheds and other items there on site. And so it's a treasure trove of information on mining processes and tools. We found a lot of information on personalities, such as Shorty Harris here, who was one of the most famous single blanket jackass prospectors and found many of the more important strikes in Death Valley. Pete Agleberry put down roots and lived in Death Valley for more than 40 years with his gold mine, and built his own mill and processed his ore. And then Louise Grantham was one of the few independent women miners in Death Valley. She ran the Grantham Talc Mine in Warm Spring Canyon and actually became a millionaire. So if you get to the park, be sure and go to the Borax Museum down at Furnace Creek, because it has a wonderful outdoor exhibit that shows next a lot of the transportation items and mining paraphernalia from the Death Valley region. Next, there are other stories I just wanted to mention in connection with Death Valley. I mean, where else would you find a Mediterranean style villa that was built by Chicago insurance executive Walter Johnson, next, who was a great friend of another well-known and legendary Death Valley prospector and con man, Walter Scott, or Death Valley Scotty. And it's a story unto itself. In the 1930s, the Civilian Conservation Corps came into Death Valley, as they did to many other Park Service units. And many of the administrative structures and campground facilities next and trails that they built that helped establish the park are still visible today. Next. From the 1930s to 40s up into the 60s, Death Valley has interesting social history because it became a haven for people wanting to get away from mainstream society and kind of get off and become desert rats. Some of them had some valid mining claims, and they just did recreational mining. Other people came to evade the law, such as Charles Manson in the 1960s, who brought his family here to Barker Ranch. Next, in 1952, the park brought in Devil's Hole, which is only known home of the Devil's Hole pupfish, a very rare and endangered species. And then in 2000, the Park Service gave the Tibisha Shoshone tribe, which had lived in the park for generations from time immemorial, 8,000 plus acres as a permanent homeland, which was kind of a unique situation. So there's a little something for everybody in Death Valley. If you do make a trip out there, you might consider staying in one of the historic hotels there, such as Furnace Creek Ranch, Furnace Creek Inn, or Stovepipe Wells Resort. And I think you'll just have a great time. And that's all I have, John.
Thank you very much, Linda. That was wonderful. And I definitely recommend visiting Death Valley. I've been to the Keene Wonder Mill and seen the tramways, and it's just incredible. I hope they've reopened. I remember last time I was in Death
Yes.
Valley, it was closed.
Yeah.
Um,
It has.
Great. Well, if you have any questions for Linda, we can take those during the Q&A period at the end. Feel free to ask those in the Q&A box, and we'll move on to the next presenters. First, we have Daniel Paul and Ben Loescher. And Daniel will make introductions of Ben, but briefly, I'll mention that Daniel Paul, he's an architectural historian. His 2004 master's thesis, The Aesthetics of Efficiency, Context in the Early Development of Late Modern Glass Skin Architecture, is a foundational text for its subject. He's lectured on this topic across the United States and Europe, and he is also a college instructor and has taught the history of Western architecture at Cerritos College in Norwalk. Also, very involved in nominating some incredible sites that I've had the pleasure of seeing too. So maybe he can talk more about some of those. But anyways, welcome, Daniel.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here, and I'm excited to present. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk now about one of those sites that I worked on, which is Pioneertown. So let's see here. I'm going to share my entire screen. Let's go to uh, play from start. Hopefully, hopefully you could see me and see the screen.
It looks good.
Is that good?
Yeah, it looks fine.
Works fine. That bound in my screen, the little column might be blocking some of it. Anyway, I don't know what to do about that. Okay. Okay. So let's just get started. Thank you for having me, CPF, and this is a wonderful panel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Pioneertown. This was a property that I got listed on the National Register of historic places in 2020. I worked with Ben, who I'm going to turn it over to in a moment, who owns property out there. And he was actually my client on this. And yeah, so we got this listed March or give or take July of 2020, worked on it in 2019. And I'm just going to give you an overview of Pioneertown, what it is, and some of the contexts that I worked with in landmarking Pioneertown. So Pioneertown is located in the high desert in San Bernardino County. It is near Joshua Tree on the way to Joshua Tree. It's a little bit higher up, so it's off Highway 62, Yucca Valley Road there. It's at an elevation of about 4,000 feet. Pioneertown was made as a movie ranch. But unique with Pioneertown is it was not only made as a movie ranch, it was basically a company town for filming Westerns, meaning this was not just a stage set. When filming was not occurring, the plan was that the stage set 19th, Wild West themed buildings were actual commercial businesses. So it was a real commercial strip that was also a filming strip. And the intention originally was that people would live out there who made these movies, and there would be housing for them. Again, just like a company town in the past, in the 19th century. This was mostly the brainchild of an actor named Dick Curtis, who played a villain in all kinds of movies and television. I seem to remember seeing him on the Three Stooges. And this is some of the early informational stuff for Pioneertown. And this is a brochure. You see Roy Rogers here. They have him all over the place on materials, but I don't think he ever filmed there. He was one of the original investors, and he was a big deal, so they were marketing the heck out of him. Here we have a sort of a parade down Main Street, and by the way, it's Mane, like a horse's mane. It's a play on a horse's mane, Main Street. An early map. So there's Dick Curtis in the middle, and Roy Rogers, Dale Evans. Oh, let me get to the next slide here. The groundbreaking, again, with Dick Curtis, Roy Rogers here, and some others. Pioneertown is named after the Sons of the Pioneers, and they actually had a very popular song called Out in Pioneertown. And the Sons of Pioneers was Roy Rogers' singing group. So here's the Pioneertown Land Office, the first building made. Most of the work was finished by 1947. The endeavor began in 1946. Here we have Roy Rogers with the Sons of the Pioneers, and this served as the main sort of headquarters for those who were interested in investing in Pioneertown or moving out there. And it was a big party for the first year or two that this existed. They kicked it off with bowling, I guess like a lot of people did back in the post-war era. So here we have Roy Rogers throwing out the ceremonial first bowling ball, and he hit a strike. Here's the interior of the Pioneertown Bowl. It's incredibly intact to this day. These murals are, painted with various Pioneertown characters, remarkably intact. Well, the fun didn't last too long. Dick Curtis died in 1952. He was only 49. And shortly thereafter, it seems like things started to get a little dicey for a bit. Before he passed away, he was actually booted off of the board. There was a lot of his investors had a different vision for Pioneertown. They didn't want it to be so much as a company town as more like a tourist destination with some filming. He was replaced by Russ Hayden, who was Hopalong Cassidy's sidekick in a lot of those TV shows. And Russ was one of the original investors too and lived close by. And you might be wondering why I have a picture of Fletcher Jones Mercedes at the bottom. They're not a sponsor of this or anything like that. Fletcher Jones was one of the original investors in Pioneertown too, and actually became a primary figure after some of this tumult, especially after Dick Curtis died. in the early 1950s. So Russell Hayden and Fletcher Jones and a couple of others kind of held things down for a bit. We don't have any architects on record, but there are two architects associated with the property. One of them is listed as Pioneertown's quote unquote planning commissioner, and that's Alexander Brandner. And here we have Mr. Brandner at Rudolf Schindler's house having Thanksgiving. Rudolf Schindler took this picture. He was friends with Schindler. And the other architect associated with the property, we don't know too much about. His name's Fred Moninger. He appears to have been a set designer for 20th Century Fox. And in 1963, he did this amazing tiki restaurant in Oxnard called the Trade Winds with this incredible sort of weird Regency almost interior and this remarkable outrigger situation. And those are the only two names we could find. There were no building permits for this. And they made these remarkable buildings. They tended to be either barns, cabins, or false front motifs. A lot of times they were made out of adobe. This was a former hardware store. This was Pioneertown Photography originally. It's made out of railroad ties, all remarkably intact. If somebody didn't know better, they would think these were from the 1800s. This was the Clip and Curl Beauty Salon. There's the original land office. It's still there. This was another beauty salon called the Beauty Corral. That's an interesting name for a beauty salon. Then even some of the newer stuff was not necessarily done following the Secretary of the Interior standards, but it seemed compatible enough. And for those of you who deal with this sort of thing regularly, we did this under criterion A. So I didn't necessarily call it out for design significance because, you know, as filming sites, these were always being changed a little bit here and there. And so we called it out for social significance associated with the movie industry. This horse trough that used to be in the middle of Main Street, some smaller buildings here, the OK Corral. This is a motel building that's still there that's made out of railroad ties. So, and a lot of these had like certain staining treatments on them. Clearly, these were done by people who knew what they were doing in terms of stage sets. And this was a post office. This was originally done as an electronics store, but it became the post office. The original post office was in the bowling alley. Pioneertown had a postmaster, and to this day, it still has its own zip code. There was originally a school there that burned in the 2006 Sawtooth Fire. Like I said, it was a functioning town. Here's our little map. I'm not going to belabor this too much. I already talked a little bit about criterion A. You can see that Main Street's very wide. And the reason why it's doubly wide was for filming purposes. So you could have people, actors, and a truck, if need be, next to it. So it was wide enough to accommodate both. In the upper right here, you have purpose-built parking lots in the 40s. No cars were allowed in this middle part here. And to this day, it is still hoof and foot only. So if you're riding a horse or if you're walking on your own 2 feet, you're fine to be in there, but you can't go in there with a car. And there's our map from the National Register nomination. Filming was a big part of Pioneertown, and part of the reason why Pioneertown ended up where it did was because of the natural terrain. If you looked to the east or the south, you had Monzo granite boulders. Actually, this is a chase road called Skyline Ranch Road where they would film stagecoach chases or whatever the case is. If you look to the north, you had buttes. So you could, if you wanted to pretend like a movie was in Mexico, you had the Sawtooths. If you wanted to do Montana, you had the buttes over here. If you look to the west, even though it doesn't look like it here, that's San Gregorio Peak. That's the tallest peak in Southern California. I think it's about 14,000 feet. So you had your Sawtooths in one direction, your buttes in the other, and your mountain peaks in another. So all of it was very intentional. And there was a lot of filming there for a while. Gene Autry filmed his show here, and various. The Gene Autry show was filmed here for a while before he moved to Flying A. And Gene Autry was an early sort of investor, I believe. Duncan Ronaldo and the Cisco Kid. When David talks a little more about Paramount, the Cisco Kid was also filmed there. And that fellow on the right, who definitely doesn't look like a cowboy, even though he's kind of dressed like one, is Philip Krasny. He was actually super important in saving Pioneertown. Of everybody involved in these early days, he was the one who sort of fulfilled the vision that Dick Curtis had for the property. Philip Krasny lived there. He took advantage of the fact, the idea here originally was that people wouldn't have to travel and you could save that money and just have all your resources in town already for filming. The people who ran the businesses were supposed to be extras. I don't know how much that was appreciated by them all the time. They probably weren't always in the mood. But here's the Cisco Kid being filmed, and there's Philip Krasny on the right. Here's some random filming shots. The Liquor Barn on the right, which is still there, Pioneertown Gazette, night filming with the moon, a dead person here, sort of filming over here by Pioneertown Photography, a stagecoach scene right here, somebody jumping out of a stagecoach. Oop, let me get to the next slide. And more filming here. Just various shots. It was known for filming. It had a lot of press early on. Krasny turned this former dance hall into an indoor filming area for the Cisco Kid. And part of what the nomination did is it contextualized the Western, and it contextualized this idea of the West. This is something that had been around for a while. The Lewis and Clark expedition going back to 1804 to 1806 piqued a lot of people's interest. The Homestead Act of 1862 encouraged people to move west and settle. I'm not, there's a lot to unpack here in terms of how we look at this with, Native American history, of course, now. But nonetheless, it was romanticized back then. Dime store novels about people like Buffalo Bill, Teddy Roosevelt, who, even though he was from New York, fell in love with the West. This early Thomas Edison movie, The Great Train Robbery from 1903, one of the first narrative films and the first Western. So clearly, this idea of moving west was becoming part of an American narrative, and it ended up, informing a lot of issues around ruggedness, independence, identity. As far as this as a vernacular, an event that seems to really have informed this was the 1935 California Pacific International Exposition in San Diego, particularly this here in the upper left called Gold Gulch, done by Harry Oliver. This was a 21-acre 49er themed camp. It was adult themed. This was not for kids. There was a lot of alcohol and a lot of sort of burlesque type situations. But one of the people who came away kind of impressed with it was Walter Knott. And shortly thereafter, Walter Knott started his ghost town in Buena Park at Knott's. Knott himself had been a Mojave Desert homesteader and worked at Calico, which is an amazing, underrated site in Yermo. It went during World War I with his uncle. And then in 1950, after he made a bunch of money at Knott's, he turned around and bought Calico and restored it and made it themed. And I'm not going to deviate too much on this, but if we're going to talk about the West, there's a lot of different things to sort of consider with it and what happens in California and this idea of freedom and independence. And even out of Walter Knott and out of Calico, you had a very interesting sort of tradition of certain folk art environments being made, individuals who are self-taught. This becomes part of a California story, even though you have folk art environments as they're now called everywhere. This is Kelvin and Ruby Black's Possum Trot, which was done just outside of Calico. It was sort of a puppet show themed Western. This is from Grandma Prisbury's Bottle Village. She got the idea to do Bottle Village out of bottles from seeing Walter Knott's bottle house at Ghost Town at Knott's Berry Farm. This is Grandma Prisbury at Watts Towers. And this was a book called In Celebration of Ourselves, which is basically about this sense of California independence. And Seymour Rosen, who wrote it, and it's a lot about art environment, says what these builders seem to have in common is whimsy, independence, and tenacity. What seems to make these people different is that they took their dreams and made the time to do something about them. He's talking about art environments, but some of that could definitely apply to moving out west and a lot of individuals coming to the West Coast to pursue their dreams and to express their own independence, if not just creatively. This Western vernacular makes its way into all kinds of other things. Davy Crockett, Disneyland's Frontierland, ranch house architecture informed by early William Worcester work, which was preservationist from 1927, the Worcester farmhouse. The work of Cliff May and Sunset Magazine in defining the Western ranch house or Western living. Concurrent with the popularity of the Western movie or Western film was the ranch house. And there were tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of them made across the state. And then the nomination also just talked about this vernacular in different ways. Nudie Cohen, who was actually a Ukrainian immigrant, became a Western clothier of the stars. Here he is with Hank Snow. Whole towns, San Dimas from 1971 near Pomona became Western themed. And this sort of Western vernacular stuck around for a while through the early 80s in California. It was just ubiquitous, and now it's all gone. I don't know if too many of you remember who these guys are, but those of us who grew up in Southern California probably know. They were around through the early 1980s. It's Homer and JR from Miller's Outpost. And this was just part of the situation here and probably part of the situation along the Greater West. By the 1960s, Pioneertown's kind of on the wane. You have some tourists there. You have this gentleman here, this pretty drunk guy in front of the Red Dog Saloon. And Pioneertown through the 60s kind of became a ghost town, ironically enough, like the ghost towns that it was sort of modeled after. By the 1970s, the main gig in town was a biker bar called the Cantina. You had a newspaper called the Jackass Mail that was delivered by an actual jackass, a donkey, and people dressing up. So the few people who lived there maintained the vibe. And then eventually you have the advent of Pappy and Harriet's from a former service station. Weirdly enough, this was not called out as a contributing resource for the nomination because its significance was later and it had a lot of changes after the end of the period of significance, which concluded in 1966. But this clearly is going to be its own important place at a certain point. This was developed by Harriet Aleba, whose parents started the Cantina, and Claude Pappy Ellen, who was a contractor who did some remarkable Western vernacular upon the building, and perhaps even more importantly, generated an incredible music scene here when it was known as Pioneertown Palace. Sort of the invisible ghost of the Pioneertown area is the musician Graham Parsons. There he is on the left in a nudie suit. And so Pioneertown, starting in the late 80s, people began to discover Pioneertown again. And by the 90s, it's rediscovered and it's reinvigorated in large part because of Pappy and Harriet's. And even Sir Paul McCartney playing there in 2016. Some of the buildings at Pioneertown are later. There's some 90s buildings there. They're not so bad. And by the 90s, Pioneertown with its new buildings and old buildings is happening. And so this kind of concludes my sort of quick overview about this. Pioneertown is significant as one of the last remaining movie ranches that's intact. It's probably the most intact movie ranch that remains. It really speaks to this, Western film history. And as commercial buildings, these are some of the last commercial Western themed vernacular buildings left in Southern California from a time when at one time there were many more. So I'm finished with my portion. I'm going to turn it over to Ben. Ben, if you want to add anything to this uh, and say a couple of things about your part in Pioneertown. I want to introduce Ben really quickly. He is the principal at Loescher Meekum Architects. He has owned property in Pioneertown for a while, particularly the Red Dog Saloon. I consider him a sort of hero for saving Pioneertown. His efforts have been relentless and constantly ongoing. Ben also owns property in Randsburg, which is another very wonderful, fascinating ghost town, or older town that he could talk about. And I know him from back in the days of the Center for Land Use Interpretation when he was more involved there. And if anybody wants to check out cluey.org, I highly recommend that as well. So Ben, I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so I'll just add a little brief kind of post-historical context, I guess, to what Daniel has been talking about, and it does loop back into the historical work that Daniel did. But the thing with Pioneertown, as I think Daniel did a really good job of explaining, is that it's got this unique feature that it was a real place, but constructed to tell fake stories, right? That's what Hollywood is all about. And this fake, it was also kind of a fake place that was inhabited by real people. We had a community that was around this filming site that was always sort of a persistent presence in the town around the filming when it was happening, and then also when they were gone, right? And I think this is something that's easily overlooked with Pioneertown when it gets discussed as sort of scenography or as merely a filming location. Is that it was also a real estate venture that was speculative but intended for folks that were sort of buying in, not just for the 22 minutes of Judge Roy Bean or any of these other B Westerns, but like full time, like, hey, I'm going to make my life part of this mythic Western lifestyle. So Daniel mentioned Pioneertown's fates kind of like rose and fell with the popularity of Westerns. It also had a bunch of features that sound familiar to those of us that have studied sort of real estate development in Southern California. There was a lot of like wild publicity and promotion of Pioneertown as a place to buy property without a whole lot behind it. There was a water tank that was giant that was constructed before there was ever a water source to kind of demonstrate to people that this was a good place to invest. The water was never found, by the way. There was a series of corporations that tried to turn Pioneertown into something much bigger than it ever ended up being, including the Golden Empire, which was this scheme in the mid 1960s to transform Pioneertown into a Western themed sort of Palm Springs with tennis courts and that sort of stuff, in addition to the equestrian facilities and shootouts and that sort of thing. But the water really was the thing that sort of stopped Pioneertown from growing, or these developers from realizing any of these schemes. And that kind of continued, basically to the present day, and is largely responsible for the reason why the site is so intact. Pioneertown's water system was always really marginal. It was private originally, and then went through a number of hands that each went bankrupt, found its way into the hands of San Bernardino County, who was kind of reluctantly stuck with managing the thing. And then by 1999, the system was so far out of compliance with federal and state water standards that they put a moratorium on new construction. So all these aggravations about water, the fact that it was really hard to get building permits, kind of disincentivized changes to the town. And the folks, when my wife and I got there in the early 2000s, the folks that like were owning Main Street really were a self-selected group that like the original people had kind of bought in. They loved the place and the imagined history and all that stuff, and were great conservators of it. Even like without any training, they'd all watched the same westerns that were being produced there and that they had grown up with, and like were pretty capable of recreating and preserving that environment. As a community, we knew this wasn't going to go on forever. So, Pioneertown's water system being out of compliance with drinking water standards, the EPA eventually had enough of this and basically forced San Bernardino County to bring it into compliance. And then as members of the community, we all realized that, hey, this was like the cork in the bottle that when it came out was going to make a significant change to how things were. And because San Bernardino County doesn't have any preservation ordinances, even a recognition program for historic properties, a number of us kind of got together and put together a plan, both to get recognition for Pioneertown for its kind of historical contributions and merits. And that's why we hired Daniel to come in and get the National Register nomination processed, but also to work with the county, which had no real recognition of what Pioneertown was, to change their zoning code. And if any of you have seen Pioneertown in the newspapers recently, that's still going on. There were a number of attempts by the county to sort of apply generic commercial zoning to Main Street, to encourage business and that sort of thing. I think we've been successful in sort of changing their perspective. They are, in fact, processing a zoning overlay or kind of specific plan for Main Street that'll allow development that's kind of compatible in character, scale, and intensity to the stuff that's there that is respectful of the character defining features of the district and all that kind of stuff. Without it also incentivizes adaptive reuse and restoration. So I'm hoping that we're kind of beyond the worst of the battles out there, but it's I think a common story. Like all of these kind of ghost towns seem to face either one of two fates. One, which is that they just sort of blow away in the wind and are abandoned or considered nuisances and demolished, or overrun by progress and all of the things that sort of make them unique and special get removed. And the only way, of course, I think I'm preaching to the crowd here, to make sure that doesn't happen is by engaging with preservation organizations as well as local governments to make sure that that doesn't happen. So that's it for me. I will hand it over to David Hertz.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ben. And we'll have some time for questions. I think what we typically do with these programs is if we're running a little over time, feel free to stay around for the questions if you are able to, and we'll take as many questions as we can. So take it away, David. I'm sure maybe you can introduce yourself. I didn't want to read your whole bio.
David, you're muted.
Muted. Okay, I am back and I'll reshare. Okay, great. Hi, you can hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. David Hertz, I'm an architect practicing now my 40th year. And an interesting segue because my grandfather was one of those adventurous people to head out west from New York after kind of difficulty distributing alcohol in New York City and New Jersey. Didn't want to die over it, and always loved being a cowboy. So he came out. This is from the original uh, Paramount Ranch guest book, and you mentioned Leo Carrillo and of course the Cisco Kid, um, and this is one of their entries, which was plentiful as Leo Carrillo and Pancho as Duncan Ronaldo filmed many episodes of Cisco Kid. There were many eras to Paramount Ranch. The Paramount Ranch itself started in 1927, went to about 1943. A couple small landholders. Our grandfather, Bill Hertz, purchased the Paramount in 1953 and had it in various forms. Until about 79, during which time there was also a racetrack, and then the National Park Service purchased Western Town in 1981, and at about 1980 had it designated as a National Register of Historic Places. 2,700 acres. The original Paramount Ranch had about 130 films there until 43. Primarily on the grounds. There was not a Western town necessarily. This is our grandfather, Bill Hertz. I mentioned plural because I think my brother, Brad, is also joined here today. But he was a city boy. He came out with our grandmother, Betty, and in 53 and purchased the ranch along with our father, Bill. And that was why it was called the 3B Ranch. And they basically built a Western town for movies at the beginning of the 50s when the resurgence of the Western, especially in television short form, became popular. They provided all the hospitality for everyone that stayed. At that point, Ventura Boulevard was dirt, and they would come out from Burbank or Hollywood by horseback. The basic structure of the complex was a series of kind of backlot structures, large warehouse buildings, and these large buildings became good supports for essentially facade set fronts, which actually, in researching this, I found that my family had actually purchased a number of the storefronts from repurposing the RKO movie ranch in 1953, which closed, and then so reassembled them. I certainly remember stories of our father dragging telephone poles down Canaan, and they were avid repurposers and recyclers and appropriators of found objects to make sets. This is a picture of our father, building one of the early set fronts, and of course being multi-purposed, he got drafted as extra in many westerns, so we still have some pretty classic photos of our father. He also performed stunts and tricks horseback for TV. So this is the Bison Archives has a lot of really great photographs, but this is essentially of the initial building of the set, some of which adjacent and attached to the buildings, and many which were freestanding. And they were essentially built over a period of time, each for the movies. So if somebody needed a saloon, they would build a saloon. If they needed a jail, they build a jail, hotel, etc. And a lot of times they were actually funded by the companies and then left. And over the years, a multi-street Western town centered around a large oak tree was used. The ranch, besides movies, was used for a lot of equestrian events and other kind of feature civic organizations, private clubs. And adjacent neighbor was Ronald Reagan. And during the National Park Archives, our grandmother told a story. She liked to, they hosted a Democratic convention there and made sure that they put that right on Ronnie's fence, which she recounted he never did pay for in the archives. But later in life, our grandfather became ill, and he brought in his cousin Sanford, and they ran all operations of everything from all the filming. But for a time, it actually did very well, and they purchased another, or actually leased the Ingram Motion Picture Ranch, and expanded the Western town into 2 locations. And managed that, but because our grandfather was ill, he really couldn't maintain both of those. And here's some pictures of that. Some of the movies, of course, too numerous to name, but some of the more recent kind of 150 episodes of Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman in later life. Even Westworld was most recently shot there, and some of the more recent assemblage of the town as it evolved organically. Some were completely shallow, and some had complete filmable interiors, some with warehouses up against them. And unfortunately, the large oak tree was consumed along with the entire town. Here's a picture of the bridge and crossing into Paramount Ranch. And unfortunately, the Woolsey fire burned the entire town, the historic town of the Hertz era, which was designated by the Secretary of Interior as a period of significance. In 2018, this is after the fire still smoldering. And unfortunately, the large oak tree perished as well. So now comes the rebuilding of the Hertz era town, which was that Western town portion, which my brother and I have been involved with the Santa Monica Mountains Fund and the National Park Service, in part to help in the restoration and rebuilding. Some sketches, renderings. It's in 2 phases. In fact, this weekend, my brother and I get to kind of go behind the fence and see the progress of phase 1, which basically rebuilds the prop shed, barn, and some of the existing buildings. And then phase 2 will be to rebuild the stage fronts. And the hope is that through building, because now there's infrastructure for real filming and sound stages with electrical lighting, et cetera, that the stage fronts will be rebuilt somewhat organically over time. Here's our grandfather in the middle of Paramount Ranch, and it's an interesting quick segue into a project that I'm currently working on with Daniel as a designation. Here's the footprint of the Woolsey fire. The eastern edge was Paramount Ranch. The western edge, where there's this basically almost a 360-degree hole. The star is a ranch that currently live at and working on and restoring it. The Tony Duquette's Folly, which was also made from a repurposed set. So Tony Duquette was a scenic artist. He was head of MGM set design. The only solo show at the Louvre American. This was his fantasy land. Greta Garbo, many celebrities, and this is Tony in what we call Xanadu originally, which was somewhat in disrepair over about 30 years until my wife Laura and I purchased it about 8 years ago and have been in the process of restoring it. There's Laura and I and our dogs. The tiles are made from the back lot of MGM, the jade from Chavez Ravine before Dodger Stadium. A lot of the sets are from The King and I. So everything from Marsden matting from World War II, a lot of appropriation of found objects from the military surplus of Port Hueneme and Point Mugu, from just in the way that we were speaking about it in terms of almost a kind of outsider art, Grandma Prispy's Bottled Village, Simon Rodia, the spirit of California, the interaction of Hollywood, the repurposing of sets to create a kind of multi-layered facade, and this village is what we've been restoring and trying to preserve. So these are some images of that, and there are other structures used in different movies throughout the property. So full circle from a kind of a family origin of repurposing and movie sets to a current passion for preservation of this unique landmark.
Wow.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. Makes me want to invite you again to do a presentation on Xanadu. So we will close this program with a brief Q&A, and I wanted to give people the opportunity, and please, if you can, it's easier for me to spot questions by using the Q&A box. So if you have a question, ask it in the Q&A box. I'll start with the first question from Dylan. This is for you, Linda. He's asking what type of maintenance is being completed at the Death Valley. He says Joshua Tree, but I think he means Death Valley mining sites, if any.
Well, when I was there, I retired in 2009, but basically, I think I mentioned that for the sites of lesser historical significance, it was basically been a treatment policy of benign neglect, which means that if there are safety issues, they would be taken care of, but no effort would be made to restore or stabilize the structures, and they'd be allowed to naturally deteriorate. But for National Register sites of local and national significance, there have been efforts made to make them safer for visitation and to stabilize and interpret them. Sites such as Skidoo and the Keen Wonder Mine, which I believe now is open, but it underwent a very strenuous stabilization restoration project. And so, there's so many hundreds of sites that there's no way they can all be taken care of and maintained, but most visitors to the sites are very appreciative of the educational value that they offer and take pretty good care of them. We did have an abandoned mineland crew when I was there who would go out and perform some stabilization work, even on some of the lesser known sites, to try to stabilize them. But it's a huge project.
Yeah, certainly. It sounds like it. It's unique challenge in terms of historic resources. It's a different kind of challenge, to try to maintain and keep these structures safe. Great. Well, thank you, Linda. Now, this question, I guess, is for Daniel. A quick question is Pioneer, or maybe Daniel had been, is Pioneertown still used for filming? And if so, are there any physical changes associated with filming, or are they all temporary?
Ben, why don't you answer that?
Yeah, so it's not used much for features anymore. There's maybe one every 2 years or something like that. And quite a bit more commercials and music videos and that sort of thing. None of them have really left any permanent kind of artifacts behind in my memory. Folks like the fact that they can kind of just come into town, it's already done, and be out of there. But we haven't seen the kind of like large kind of set production that's happening in New Mexico or places like that.
Okay. I'll move. I have another question, but maybe I'll get to that later. But there was a question about Paramount Ranch for you, David, and this is an interesting question. Somebody was there 2 years ago, I guess. which would be, I suppose, after the fire. And they said that there was a church and train depot. Do you know if they survived the fire or were they rebuilt or reconstructed?
So the train depot was built in the era outside of significance. That was built for the Dr. Quinn medicine woman, and the chapel was built recently for Westworld. And they were built on the outskirts of the western town, and they survived the fire. But they were not part of the designated rebuilding or the area of significance.
Yeah, and I wish I had been able to read your bio because it seems like you have a special background in resiliency and natural hazard kind of resiliency for structures. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are in this plan to reconstruct portions of Paramount Ranch or bring back what was there. What sort of thought has been given to sort of a resilient approach to making sure these structures survive the next fire, maybe?
Right. I mean, I think the reality is in the wildland urban interface, which is becoming more and more hostile, one has to really think about resilience. 88% of the Santa Monica Mountains burned in the Woolsey fire. And as you saw with Xanadu, these are present in mind. If we're going to have anything that's going to have any history, then it has to be able to survive fire. So the National Park Service has definitely provided a lot more infrastructure for the rebuilding of Paramount Ranch to deal with fire resilience in the future.
Right. Yeah. That's good to know. I guess there was a question on Pioneertown. It was specific to one of your slides, Daniel. The night film was being shot in the barn by the moon view. Do you know what film that was?
Uh, no, I don't, but this leads into something I want to mention. Many of those slides, there's a website called Pioneertown Sun, and it's curated or sort of organized by a man named Kurt Sauter. And I want to thank Pioneertown Sun for, those pictures. And many of my archival photos came off the Pioneertown website that Kurt has accumulated over time. So I would suggest going onto the Pioneertown website, going into the photos. There's a link for like archival photos. It's a little hard to get to. Sometimes I get to this link that says no access allowed, but there's a workaround. You'll find it. And I think the sort of moon picture is labeled there. And if there's a question for someone else, I'll just try to jump on myself and try to find it while someone else is answering a question.
Yeah. I'll also note that a lot of the photos of Pioneertown from that filming era, because the productions and the development and promotion of the town were all having simultaneously. A lot of them are staged, right? So like they were actually like creating, moments just for purposes of publicity. Like even the things that look real, they were very self-aware and trying to represent, um, film production to the world in a very careful way.
Funny.
That's good to know. Thank you, Ben. I don't see any further questions. However, while I quickly go over the closeout, if any questions pop up, I'll bring them up. But as we close out here, I wanted to share with people, or as I mentioned earlier, today is Giving Tuesday, and I want to encourage everybody to check out our auction and also donate to the California Preservation Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, so your donations are tax deductible. And a number of these items may be of interest, but I wanted to point out specifically one, which was an offering courtesy of Heyday Books, The Deserts of California, California Field Atlas, which has a whole section devoted to Death Valley. So currently one bid, so you might have to compete on this item with somebody else. But our auction has about 30 items, and we encourage you to go to californiapreservation.org/bid. We'll be promoting items specific to the programs over the next 2 weeks for part 2 and 3 as well. And so check it out. And also, if you feel generous and you'd like to donate to the CPF to help us continue our good work of protecting places like our great speakers today. So thank you again to our speakers. I don't see any other questions come in through the Q&A box. Any final words from our panelists? I'll give each of you an opportunity to have any parting words you'd like to say. Starting with, we'll go in order of presentations. Linda.
No, I can't think of any, except that thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to this group. I'm going to have to join and start attending some more of these, because you certainly have some interesting subjects. But no, I would just, in terms of Death Valley and its resources, encourage everyone to visit the park and take advantage of all that it has to offer. I didn't even touch very much on the natural resources, but there are certainly very significant natural ones too. So, as I said, there's something for everybody, and I would encourage folks to visit when they can.
Thank you. And Daniel and Ben?
I'm very thankful for this opportunity, and I'm fascinated by this idea that something that was once so ubiquitous as to almost be invisible in everyday life, like the Western vernacular once was, at least where I grew up here in Southern California, that it can suddenly be gone. When I was a child, I feel like it was everywhere, and it was just part of the culture. And it's understandable why that changed. I mean, it started in the 60s, with a lot of changes, but unless there's preservation, there's not going to be any trace left at all. And so I'm very thankful for the opportunities I've been given to preserve these special places and to do so for my home, for Southern California, and in honor of California in general and the West.
Yeah, I'll echo that, and also note that I think one of the things that makes them so important is because they are these filming environments are representational constructions, right? They're intended to tell stories, and even when they're made up, I think they tell us a lot about ourselves, our values and priorities, and that sort of thing. And that's reason enough, I think, to preserve and respect them.
Thanks, Ben. And last but not least, David Hertz.
Well, the Latin phrase "ars longus, vita brevis" comes to mind. Art is long, life is short. So we're all passing through, and the things that we leave, and for those of us that are stewards, to be able to help give meaning to them, give history and preservation, it keeps other times, periods, and cultures alive. And I think that that's a noble and worthwhile thing to be doing.
Wonderful way to close it out, David. Thank you. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. If you'd like to watch the recording, you'll find it at our YouTube channel. I'll send it by email after the end of the program. A big round of applause for our speakers. We hope you'll join us for part 2 and part 3. Part 2, we'll look at spring water-based resorts, hot springs, and you'll learn about 2 very specific California examples next Tuesday. And then the following Tuesday, the 17th, is when our auction closes, and that will look at the architecture of department stores and shopping centers with noted historians who have looked at those sites. So we thank you again for being a part of this series, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.